Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into something a little different, a story that makes your worst family drama look like a pleasant Sunday brunch. We're talking about the boy prince who rotted alive, imprisoned by his own father. And yes, before you ask, this is exactly as cheerful as it sounds. So grab your favorite beverage, get comfortable, and if you're enjoying the content, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more stories about people having spectacularly terrible times in history. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because apparently masochism is a global phenomenon, and I'm curious about our international audience of people who enjoy psychological horror disguised as historical fiction. Now, you might be thinking, oh, this is just another prison story, how bad could it really be? Sweet summer child, this isn't your typical wrongfully imprisoned hero eventually escapes and gets revenge narrative. No, this is the story of what happens when a paranoid king decides that the best way to handle his daddy issues is to slowly torture his own son into madness. Except plot twist, the torture backfires in the most spectacular way possible. We're about to explore 30 months of psychological destruction that somehow transforms a terrified 13-year-old prince into the most effective ruler his kingdom ever had. It's like watching someone get struck by lightning and emerge with superpowers, except the lightning is existential dread and the superpowers are an uncomfortable ability to read human nature. So dim those lights, maybe put on some ambient noise if you're into that sort of thing, and let's settle in for a tale that proves the human spirit is both more fragile and more resilient than anyone wants to admit. This is the story of how the worst thing that could happen to someone became, paradoxically, the best training for leadership imaginable. Because nothing says, qualified to rule, quite like surviving your father's attempt to break your mind through architectural depression and controlled starvation. It's like a really twisted internship program, except instead of making coffee, you're learning the fundamental nature of human suffering while slowly losing your sanity in a stone box. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll never complain about your family dynamics again. You want to know about power? Real power. Let me tell you about King Uldric the Ironbound, a man so paranoid he once executed his own shadow for following him too closely. This is the story of his son, Prince Cassius, though by the end you'll wonder if that title meant anything more than designated victim with good posture. Picture this: a kingdom where trust was rarer than dragon eggs and twice as dangerous. Uldric had clawed his way to the throne through a combination of strategic marriages, convenient accidents, and what historians politely call aggressive diplomacy. Translation: he murdered anyone who looked at his crown sideways. The man had survived 3 assassination attempts before breakfast on most days, and that was just from his own family. So when his wife, Queen Alara, died giving birth to little Cassius, Uldric didn't grieve. He calculated. Here was a potential heir, yes, but also a potential threat, because nothing says succession crisis like a charming prince with legitimate bloodline claims and the audacity to exist. Cassius grew up in what you might generously call a complicated household. Imagine growing up where your bedtime stories were cautionary tales about uncles who tried to poison the porridge, and your father's idea of bonding time was teaching you to identify the 17 different ways someone might try to kill you before lunch. The boy learned to walk, talk, and duck in roughly the same developmental window. The castle wasn't a home, it was a maximum security facility disguised as a residence. Every servant was a potential spy, every meal a possible Last Supper, and every hug from dear old dad came with the unspoken threat of a dagger between the ribs if you squeezed too tight. Uldric had turned paranoia into an art form, and his son was his masterpiece of anxiety. But here's the thing about children, they're remarkably adaptable. While most kids worry about monsters under the bed, Cassius worried about monsters at the dinner table. He learned to read people's faces like battle maps, understanding that a twitch of an eye could mean the difference between living to see tomorrow or becoming another. Tragic accident. In the family chronicles, the boy was smart, dangerously smart. By age 7, he could spot a lie from across the throne room. By 10, he understood palace politics better than most of his father's advisors. By 12, he'd figured out something that would have made lesser men wet themselves with terror His father was afraid of him, not because Cassius was threatening. The kid was about as menacing as a wet kitten in a thunderstorm. No, Aldrich feared him because the boy represented everything the king couldn't control: the future, bloodline legitimacy, and the uncomfortable possibility that someone might actually be better at this whole ruling thing than he was. You see, Cassius had inherited something from his mother that his father lacked entirely: the ability to inspire genuine loyalty. While Aldrich ruled through fear, intimidation, and the liberal application of executions, his son had this annoying habit of making people actually like him. Servants would smile when they saw the prince. Guards would nod respectfully rather than just avoiding eye contact. Even the castle dogs seemed to prefer his company. This was, in Aldrich's mind, treason of the highest order. The turning point came during Cassius's 13th birthday celebration. Picture the scene: a grand feast, nobles from across the kingdom, enough food to feed a small army, and entertainment that cost more than most people's annual income. The boy was officially coming of age, transitioning from potential threat to definite problem. During the festivities, something happened that made Aldrich's blood run colder than a winter morning in the Northern Territories. The crowd, when toasting the prince, cheered louder than they ever had for the king. It wasn't malicious, they genuinely loved the boy, but to a man who measured loyalty in decibels and calculated affection like a military strategist, this was tantamount to a declaration of war. That night, after the last drunk noble had stumbled home and the servants had cleaned up the remnants of celebration, Aldrich made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his considerably shortened life. He would solve his Cassius problem the same way he'd solved every other problem: through strategic elimination. But here's where it gets interesting. Aldrich couldn't just have his son killed outright. Too obvious, too messy, and frankly, too likely to result in a full-scale rebellion. The people love Prince Cassius, and martyrdom has this inconvenient way of making dead princes infinitely more dangerous than living ones. No, the king needed something more subtle, something that would remove the threat without creating a symbol. He needed his son to simply disappear. Not in a tragic hunting accident way, but in a slowly forgotten, until he's just another historical footnote way. So Aldrich did what any loving father would do. He had his 13-year-old son arrested for treason. The charges were, to put it mildly, creative. Conspiracy against the crown, plotting with foreign enemies, practicing forbidden magic, and my personal favourite, excessive charisma in the presence of nobility. The trial was a masterpiece of judicial theatre, with predetermined outcomes and witnesses who'd been encouraged to remember things that may or may not have actually happened. Cassius, standing before the court in chains that were almost too heavy for his young frame, didn't even try to defend himself. He'd figured out the game long before the first witness took the stand. This wasn't about justice, it was about elimination. His father had found a legal way to commit filicide, and the law would applaud him for it. The sentence wasn't death. Death would have been merciful, and mercy wasn't in Aldrich's vocabulary. Instead, the court declared that Prince Cassius would be imprisoned in the Tower of Sorrows, a charming little structure built into the castle's foundation that had been specifically designed for people the king wanted to forget about. The Tower of Sorrows wasn't just a prison, it was a masterpiece of psychological torture disguised as architecture. Built 3 stories underground, it was a circular stone chamber about 12 feet in diameter, with walls that wept moisture year round and a ceiling low enough to make standing upright a challenge for anyone over 5 feet tall. There was one window, if you could call it that, a narrow slit about 6 inches wide that faced north, ensuring that direct sunlight was as rare as royal compassion. The opening was positioned just high enough that you had to stand on your toes to see out, and all you could see was a small section of the castle courtyard where people went about their daily lives, blissfully unaware that a prince was rotting away beneath their feet. The furnishings were Spartan in the extreme: a stone bench that served as both seat and bed, a bucket for waste that was emptied once a week whether it needed it or not, and a small wooden bowl for food that looked like it had been carved by someone with a grudge against both wood and craftsmanship. They gave him one blanket, thin as hope and about as warming, one change of clothes, because apparently even political prisoners deserve clean underwear once a month. And one book, a religious text about the importance of accepting divine will, which under the circumstances felt less like spiritual guidance and more like cosmic sarcasm. The door was solid oak reinforced with iron bands, secured with 3 separate locks, and designed to open only from the outside, because nothing says temporary detention like a door that requires a full construction crew to breach. But here's the truly diabolical part of Aldrich's plan. The Tower of Sorrows was constructed with just enough comfort to keep someone alive, but not enough to let them live. It was a carefully calibrated machine of slow destruction, designed to break both body and spirit over the course of years rather than days. The food came twice a day, morning gruel that tasted like liquid disappointment, and evening bread that had the consistency and flavour of leather that had lost its will to live. Occasionally, there would be a piece of fruit or a bit of cheese, but these treats were rare enough to feel like small miracles and frequent enough to maintain the cruel illusion that someone, somewhere, still cared. Water arrived in a clay pitcher that held exactly enough for one person to survive, but not enough for basic hygiene. Bathing became a luxury reserved for the weekly bucket emptying ceremony, when a guard would throw a cup of water at you with all the enthusiasm of someone fertilizing a garden they didn't particularly care about. The guards rotated weekly, ensuring that no one would develop anything resembling personal attachment to the prisoner. They were instructed to speak only when absolutely necessary, to avoid eye contact, and to treat the entire situation as routine maintenance rather than the imprisonment of a human being. This was psychological warfare at its finest, death by systematic dehumanization. Cassius, age 13, found himself in a stone womb designed to birth only madness and despair. The first week, he spent his time pacing the circumference of his cell, counting steps, measuring distances, mapping every stone and crack like an explorer charting unknown territory. 12 feet in diameter meant roughly 30, 7 feet around, which at his current stride length meant about 40, 6 steps per circuit. He did the math constantly, obsessively. If he walked for 1 hour at his normal pace, he would complete approximately 80 circuits, covering roughly 3,000 feet, or about half a mile. It was something to focus on, something to control in a world where control had become as rare as sunlight. The second week, he tried to maintain a schedule. Wake up when the morning gruel arrived, eat slowly to make it last, exercise for 2 hours, stand at the window for another hour watching the courtyard, read from his religious text, exercise again, eat the evening bread, then attempt to sleep. Structure was sanity, routine was resistance. By the third week, the schedule began to blur. Days merged into nights, meals became indistinguishable from one another, and time transformed from a measurable quantity into a subjective experience that seemed to stretch and compress without warning. He would read the same passage from his book over and over, not because it provided comfort, but because the act of reading gave his mind something to grip onto. The fourth week brought the first real test of his mental fortitude. He woke one morning to discover that his food had not arrived. No gruel, no water, no acknowledgement that he existed. For a moment, he wondered if this was it, if his father had finally decided that slow torture was taking too long and had chosen simple starvation instead. But the food came that evening, along with an extra portion that suggested the missed morning had been intentional. A reminder, perhaps, that even the small mercy of regular feeding was entirely at the king's discretion. The message was clear: you are alive because I allow it, and you will die when I decide it. This psychological manipulation continued throughout the first month, with random variations in feeding schedules, water delivery, and even the weekly bucket emptying ceremony. Sometimes the guards would speak to each other in whispers just outside his door, discussing the weather or their families or the price of grain, just loud enough for him to hear, but too quietly for him to join in. It was a reminder that life continued outside his stone prison, that the world was moving forward while he remained frozen in place. By the second month, Cassius had developed what could charitably be called coping mechanisms. He created imaginary friends from the shadows cast by his single candle, naming them after characters from stories his mother had told him before her death. He held conversations with these shadow people, debating philosophy, discussing politics, and sometimes just talking about the weather. He could barely see through his narrow window. His body began to show the effects of confinement and malnutrition. The lean muscle he'd developed through sword training and riding horses melted away, replaced by the soft weakness of inactivity. His skin grew pale as milk, his hair became lank and lifeless, and his clothes began to hang on him like a scarecrow's costume. But his mind remained sharp, perhaps sharpened by necessity. He memorized every word of his religious text, not out of newfound faith, but because it was the only intellectual exercise available to him. He created elaborate mental games, building imaginary castles stone by stone, populating them with complex characters, and living out entire fictional lives in the space between sleeping and waking. The third month brought visitors, though not the kind one might hope for. Rats, drawn by the smell of food and waste, began to appear in the darker corners of his cell. At first, he tried to drive them away, throwing his wooden bowl at them or stomping his feet to frighten them off. But gradually, he came to appreciate their company. They were living creatures, proof that the world contained more than just stone walls and iron doors. He began saving small portions of his bread for them, creating a routine of morning feeding that provided structure to his increasingly formless days. The rats, in their simple way, became his congregation, and he their unwilling priest, delivering sermons about survival and the strange comfort of routine. By the fourth month, Cassius had lost track of the days. Time had become fluid, measured not in hours or weeks but in meals, bucket emptyings, and the gradual decay of his own body. His fingernails had grown long and ragged, his beard had begun to grow in patches, and his clothes had developed a permanent smell that was part must, part despair, and part something indescribable. He discovered that pain could be a form of entertainment. Not self-harm, exactly, but the exploration of sensation in a world where sensation had become rare. The rough stone walls could provide different textures depending on how you touched them. The cold iron of his door felt different from the cold stone of the floor. Even the taste of his own blood, when he accidentally bit his tongue, was a change from the monotony of gruel and bread. The fifth month marked the first time he forgot his own name. Not permanently, but for a few terrifying hours. He couldn't remember if he was Cassius or someone else entirely. The identity crisis passed, but it left him shaken in a way that physical discomfort never had. If he lost his name, his sense of self, what would be left? He began a new routine every morning. He would recite everything he could remember about his life before the tower. His mother's smile, his father's paranoia, the taste of fresh fruit, the feeling of sunlight on his face, the sound of laughter echoing through castle halls. It became a form of prayer, a daily resurrection of the person he had been before stone walls and shadow companions. The sixth month brought the first serious illness, a fever that started as a minor discomfort and escalated into hallucinations that were more vivid than reality. For 3 days, he lived in a world where the walls were made of gold, where his mother visited him nightly, and where he could taste colours and hear the thoughts of his rat congregation. When the fever broke, he found himself fundamentally changed, not just physically weaker, but mentally more flexible. The line between reality and imagination had blurred permanently, and he discovered that this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Imagination could be a form of escape, and the escape was survival. By the 7th month, he had developed a complete mythology around his imprisonment. In his mind, he wasn't a prince imprisoned by his father. He was a hero undergoing a spiritual trial, tested by the gods to prove his worthiness for some greater destiny. The rats weren't vermin, they were sacred messengers. The guards weren't jailers, they were unwitting servants of fate. This reframing allowed him to endure what might otherwise have driven him completely mad. Instead of being a victim of his father's paranoia, he became the protagonist of his own epic story. The tower wasn't a prison, it was a chrysalis, and someday he would emerge transformed. The 8th month marked the first major physical deterioration. His teeth began to loosen from malnutrition, his gums bled regularly, and his hair had started falling out in patches. His reflection in the small puddle that formed in one corner of his cell during rainstorms showed a stranger, hollow-eyed, skeletal, with the complexion of old parchment. But his mind had adapted remarkably. He had created an entire internal universe, complete with geography, history, and inhabitants. He could spend hours exploring imaginary lands, solving complex problems that existed only in his thoughts, and living adventures that were more real to him than his physical surroundings. The 9th month brought the first serious doubt about his survival. Not fear of death, exactly, but a growing awareness that his body was failing in ways that might be irreversible. His joints ached constantly, his vision had begun to blur, and he found himself sleeping more and more, not from choice but from simple inability to remain conscious. He began to write, using a sharp stone to scratch words into the softer mortar between the stones of his wall. Not a plea for help or a record of his suffering, but poetry. Strange, disconnected verses about transformation, about the beauty of solitude, about the strange comfort of despair. The physical act of carving words helped keep his hands steady and his mind focused. The 10th month marked the first visit from his father. Not in person, of course, but in the form of dreams that were so vivid they felt like visitations. In these dreams, King Aldrich would appear in his cell, sometimes angry, sometimes sad, sometimes confused about why his son was imprisoned at all. These dream conversations became a form of therapy, allowing Cassius to work through his feelings about his situation without the danger of actual confrontation. He could express his anger, his disappointment, his love, and his hatred all in the safety of his own unconscious mind. By the 11th month, the distinction between sleeping and waking had become largely academic. He existed in a state of constant semi-consciousness, aware of his surroundings, but equally aware of his internal landscape. The rats had become his primary companions, and he had learned to interpret their behavior as a form of communication. His body had reached a state of equilibrium with malnutrition and confinement. He was dying, certainly, but dying slowly enough that death felt more like a gradual fading than an event with a specific timeline. His skin had developed a translucent quality. His bones showed clearly through minimal flesh, and his movements had slowed to a pace that conserved every calorie. The 12th month brought a strange sense of completion. He had survived a full year in conditions designed to break him, and while he was undoubtedly broken in many ways, he was also strangely intact. His identity had evolved rather than disappeared, his sanity had bent rather than snapped, and his spirit had transformed rather than died. He began to see his imprisonment not as punishment but as education. He had learned things about human endurance, about the nature of consciousness, about the relationship between body and spirit that no prince in the history of the kingdom had ever learned. This knowledge felt valuable, even if he would never have the opportunity to use it. The 13th month marked the beginning of what he thought of as his second year, though his ability to track time accurately had long since deteriorated. His body had stabilized at a weight that was probably half of what it had been when he entered the tower, but it had stopped losing weight. His mind had developed new pathways, new ways of processing experience that were probably closer to madness than sanity, but felt like enlightenment. He had learned to see in near, complete darkness, to find nourishment in foods that barely qualified as edible, to find entertainment in the simple act of breathing. More importantly, he had learned that the human spirit was far more adaptable than he had ever imagined. The 14th month brought the first sign that his situation might change. Not rescue, not release, but subtle shifts in the behavior of his guards that suggested something in the outside world was different. They seemed more nervous, more hurried in their duties, more likely to whisper among themselves. Through his tiny window, he could occasionally see increased activity in the courtyard. More messengers, more soldiers, more of the kind of bustling urgency that suggested political crisis. He allowed himself to hope, briefly, that perhaps his father's paranoia had finally caught up with him in ways that might benefit a forgotten prince. The 15th month confirmed his suspicions. The castle was preparing for war, though he couldn't determine with whom or why. The quality of his food improved slightly, not out of compassion, but because the castle's stores were being refreshed with supplies for a potential siege. Even prisoners benefited from military logistics. He used this slight improvement in nutrition to begin rebuilding his physical strength, as much as possible within his confines. Not because he believed rescue was imminent, but because the act of trying to improve his condition felt like resistance. Every push-up, every stretch, Every attempt to walk normally was a rejection of his father's plan to break him completely. The 16th month brought news, delivered inadvertently by guards who had grown careless in their conversations outside his door. King Aldrich was facing a rebellion led by several prominent nobles who had grown tired of his increasingly erratic behavior. The kingdom was fracturing, and civil war seemed inevitable. This news filled Cassius with complex emotions. On one hand, it suggested that his father might finally face consequences for his actions. On the other hand, civil war would likely make his own situation even more precarious. Forgotten princes in towers had a way of becoming casualties of war, regardless of which side won. He began to prepare mentally for the possibility that he might die in his cell, not from the slow torture of imprisonment, but from the quick violence of political change. The thought was strangely comforting. At least it would be an ending, rather than an endless continuation. The 17th month brought the first direct effects of the civil war to his immediate environment. His guards were reduced from 3 to 1. His food deliveries became irregular, and the maintenance of his cell virtually stopped. The bucket went unemptied for weeks at a time, turning his already unpleasant environment into something truly horrific. But these hardships also brought opportunity. With fewer guards and less attention, he was able to explore possibilities that had been impossible before. Using his sharp stone, he began working on the mortar around one of the stones in his wall, not with any real hope of escape, but simply to have a project that might outlast his own life. The 18th month marked what he thought of as his transformation from prisoner to artifact. His body had adapted so completely to his environment that he was no longer really human in any conventional sense. He was something new, something evolved specifically for survival in impossible conditions. His senses had sharpened in some ways and dulled in others. He could detect minute changes in air pressure that indicated weather shifts days in advance, could identify individual rats by their footstep patterns, could taste the emotional state of his guards in the quality of food they brought. But his ability to remember his life before imprisonment had begun to fade, replaced by the immediate reality of stone and shadow. The 19th month brought the first direct contact with the outside world beyond his guards. A new prisoner was brought to a cell somewhere nearby, close enough that Cassius could hear crying and pleading through the stone walls. The sound of another human voice, even in distress, was like music after months of silence. He tried to communicate with this new prisoner by tapping on the walls, creating simple rhythms that might convey basic messages. Whether the other prisoner understood or responded was unclear, but the attempt at communication provided a sense of purpose that had been missing from his existence. The 20th month saw the arrival of winter, identifiable by the increased dampness in his cell and the occasional snow that drifted through his tiny window. Winter in the tower was particularly brutal, as the stone walls conducted cold with enthusiastic efficiency, turning his cell into something resembling a tomb. But winter also brought a strange beauty. The snow that accumulated on his windowsill was the first truly clean, purely white thing he had seen in over a year. He would stare at it for hours, mesmerized by its simple perfection, its complete indifference to the human suffering occurring just inches away. The 21st month brought the first serious consideration of escape, not because he believed it was possible, but because the mental exercise of planning an escape provided his mind with complex problems to solve. He mapped every stone, calculated every angle, considered every possible tool or alley. The plan he developed was elaborate, requiring months of preparation, perfect timing, and several small miracles. It was completely impossible, but it was also complete, detailed, and mentally engaging. The impossibility didn't matter. The planning process kept his mind sharp and his spirit engaged. The 22nd month marked the arrival of spring, bringing with it a renewal of hope that felt as dangerous as it was welcome. The increased sunlight through his window, the sound of birds in the courtyard, the slight warming of the air all suggested that the world continued to turn, that life continued to flourish somewhere beyond stone walls. This hope was dangerous because hope required energy, and energy was a finite resource in his condition. But it was also necessary because hope was what separated existence from mere survival. He allowed himself to dream, briefly, of seeing sunlight again. of breathing fresh air, of speaking to another human being as an equal rather than a forgotten remnant. The 23rd month brought illness again, more serious this time. Not fever, but a deep weakness that suggested his body's systems were beginning to fail in more fundamental ways. His heart beat irregularly, his breathing became laboured, and his vision began to fade around the edges. He faced this potential final decline with surprising equanimity. Death would be an escape of sorts, and after nearly 2 years in the tower, escape in any form had begun to seem attractive. He had proven something to himself about human endurance, about the persistence of consciousness under impossible conditions. That seemed like enough. The 24th month brought visitors of a different sort, officials from the court, nervous men who peered through the small window in his door and spoke in hushed voices about the situation and appropriate responses. He couldn't hear their full conversations, but their presence suggested that his existence had once again become politically relevant. The civil war, it seemed, was reaching some kind of conclusion, and various factions were calculating the value of different potential allies or threats. A prince, even a forgotten one, might have strategic importance in the right circumstances. His survival, which had seemed like mere biological persistence, might actually have political implications. The 25th month brought the first direct communication from the outside world in the form of a letter slipped through his food slot. It was unsigned, written in a careful hand, and contained just a few lines. Your situation is known. Your survival matters. Patience is required, but hope is not foolish. He read the letter hundreds of times, analyzing every word, every curve of every letter, trying to extract maximum meaning from minimal information. The paper itself was valuable intelligence, high quality, expensive, suggesting someone with resources and position. The handwriting was educated but not necessarily noble, implying perhaps a scribe or educated commoner rather than aristocracy. Most importantly, the letter's existence proved that he had not been completely forgotten, that somewhere in the wider world, someone knew he was alive and considered his survival important. This knowledge transformed his entire psychological relationship with his imprisonment. He was no longer just enduring, he was waiting. The 26th month saw significant changes in his treatment. Better food, more regular delivery, and the first medical attention he had received since his imprisonment began. A physician visited him, examining his condition with professional detachment and prescribing treatments that suggested someone wanted him to recover his health, at least partially. The physician, a nervous man who refused to make eye contact, provided medications that began to address some of the more serious effects of his confinement. His teeth stopped bleeding, his vision cleared somewhat, and his strength began to return in small increments. The improvement felt miraculous after 2 years of gradual decline. The 27th month brought news that the civil war had ended with his father's death. King Aldrich had been killed in battle, struck down by an arrow from an unknown archer, while rallying his troops for what would be his final charge. The kingdom was now under the control of a regency council pending the resolution of various succession claims. This news hit Cassius with unexpected complexity. Relief that his tormentor was dead, grief for the father who had once loved him, fear about what his father's death meant for his own future, and a strange emptiness at the anticlimactic end of their relationship. He had imagined confronting his father, demanding explanations, seeking some form of justice or closure. Death had eliminated all those possibilities. The 28th month saw his first visitors in over 2 years, members of the Regency Council, who came to evaluate the situation and determine how to handle the problem of a living prince with legitimate claims to the throne. They were shocked by his condition, clearly having expected to find either a corpse or a madman. Instead, they found something more unsettling. A young man who had been broken and rebuilt by his experience, who spoke with the calm detachment of someone who had moved beyond normal human concerns. He answered their questions clearly and rationally, but with an otherworldly quality that made them visibly uncomfortable. The 29th month brought the beginning of preparation for his release, though the term, release, was complicated by the reality that the person who would emerge from the tower was fundamentally different from the boy who had entered it. He was physically changed beyond recognition, psychologically transformed in ways that might never be fully understood, and spiritually evolved into something that didn't quite fit normal categories. The process of reintegration began slowly, with gradual increases in food quality and quantity, the introduction of books beyond his single religious text, and visits from various court officials who tried to assess his mental state and political reliability. They were looking for the prince they remembered, but that person no longer existed. The 30th month marked his actual release from the Tower of Sorrows, though by this point the concept of freedom had become almost abstract. He emerged into sunlight that hurt his eyes, breathed air that felt thin and insubstantial, and walked on ground that seemed to move beneath his feet like the deck of a ship. The world outside his cell was simultaneously exactly as he remembered and completely alien. Colours seemed too bright, sounds too sharp, smells too complex. Human faces were fascinating landscapes of emotion and intention that he could read with uncanny accuracy, but found difficult to relate to. He had become something like a prophet, someone who had travelled to a place beyond normal human experience and returned with knowledge that couldn't be easily communicated. The castle itself felt like a museum of his former life, filled with artifacts from a time when he had been a different person entirely. His old rooms had been preserved exactly as he had left them, creating a strange temporal displacement where he could see the physical evidence of the boy he had been, but could no longer access the emotional reality of that existence. His appearance shocked everyone who had known him before. The robust, healthy prince had been replaced by a figure that seemed carved from shadow and determination, with eyes that had seen too much and a presence that made people instinctively step back. He looked like someone who had died and returned, which was not entirely inaccurate. The Regency Council faced a complex problem. What to do with a prince who was legally entitled to consideration for the throne, but who had been so fundamentally changed by his experience that his fitness to rule was questionable. He was clearly intelligent, perhaps more so than before, but his intelligence had a quality that made conventional politicians nervous. During his first formal meeting with the council, Cassius demonstrated abilities that hadn't existed before his imprisonment. He could read the motivations and fears of everyone in the room with supernatural accuracy, could predict their arguments before they made them, and could manipulate conversations with subtle shifts in tone and emphasis that made grown men agree to things they hadn't intended to agree to. But he used these abilities with a detachment that was almost clinical, as if he were conducting experiments on human behavior rather than participating in politics. He seemed less interested in power than in understanding the mechanisms by which power operated, less concerned with ruling than with observing the strange theatre of governance. The council eventually reached a compromise that satisfied no one completely but avoided civil war. Cassius would be recognized as the legitimate heir, but would rule through a council of advisors until he reached the age of 25 and demonstrated sufficient recovery from his ordeal to govern independently. It was a solution that acknowledged his rights while protecting the kingdom from potential instability. Cassius accepted this arrangement with the same calm detachment he showed toward everything else, though those who knew how to read his expressions could see subtle signs of amusement. He understood that the council members believed they were controlling him, and he found their confidence entertaining rather than insulting. The coronation ceremony was a study in contradictions, a celebration of his survival and ascension that was also a funeral for the boy he had been. The crown felt strange on his head, not because it was heavy, but because it was so light compared to the invisible weights he had carried in the tower. The cheers of the crowd seemed to come from a great distance, as if he were hearing them through water. In his first address as king, Cassius spoke about transformation, about the strange gifts that could emerge from the darkest experiences, about the importance of remembering that power was temporary, while suffering was instructive. The speech was beautiful, profound, and deeply unsettling to anyone who had expected conventional royal rhetoric about glory and destiny. The early years of his reign were marked by policies that reflected his unique perspective on human nature and social organization. He reformed the justice system to focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment, understanding better than most the futility of using suffering as a tool for behavior modification. He restructured the military to prioritize defense over conquest, having learned firsthand the cost of treating other people as expendable resources. Most remarkably, he established what he called chambers of reflection, small, comfortable rooms where people could voluntarily experience brief periods of solitude and sensory deprivation. These weren't punishment cells but meditation spaces, based on his belief that controlled exposure to isolation could provide insights that were impossible to achieve through normal experience. His court was unlike any in the kingdom's history. He surrounded himself with advisors who had experienced significant hardship, former prisoners, survivors of disasters, people who had lost everything and rebuilt their lives from nothing. He found that such individuals understood the true nature of resilience and could provide counsel that was grounded in reality rather than theory. The kingdom prospered under his rule, but it was a strange kind of prosperity. Economic growth was steady but not spectacular. Military victories were rare, but defeats were even rarer, and social harmony was maintained through methods that other rulers found difficult to understand or replicate. Cassius seemed to govern by understanding the hidden motivations that drove human behavior, rather than by imposing his will through force or charisma. Foreign diplomats found him fascinating and unnerving in equal measure. He could negotiate agreements that left everyone satisfied, but somehow feeling as if they had revealed more than they intended. He seemed to see through diplomatic language to the fears and desires that actually motivated international relations, and he used this understanding to create solutions that addressed underlying problems rather than surface symptoms. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his reign was the way he treated former enemies. Several of the nobles who had supported his father's decision to imprison him found themselves not only pardoned, but welcomed into positions of responsibility within his government. He seemed to understand that people's worst actions often emerged from their deepest fears, and that addressing the fears was more effective than punishing the actions. This forgiveness wasn't born from weakness or saintliness, but from a profound understanding of human nature that had been earned through experience no textbook could provide. He had learned in the tower that hatred required more energy than he could afford, that revenge was a luxury for people who hadn't faced real powerlessness, and that true strength came from the ability to transform poison into medicine. The kingdom's enemies found him impossible to predict or counter using conventional strategies. Military threats were met with offers of economic partnership. Diplomatic insults were responded to with invitations to cultural exchange. Attempts at intimidation were countered with demonstrations of genuine understanding for the pressures that drove aggressive behavior. This approach to governance was deeply rooted in his tower experience, where he had learned that survival required adaptation rather than resistance, that endurance was more valuable than aggression, and that the most profound victories came from transforming oneself rather than defeating others. As years passed, the story of the boy prince who had rotted alive in his father's prison became legend. But the legend missed the most important truth. Cassius hadn't simply survived his imprisonment, he had been fundamentally reconstructed by it. The tower had stripped away everything non-essential about his identity and rebuilt him as something new. A ruler who understood power because he had been completely powerless, who valued freedom because he had lived without it, and who could inspire loyalty because he had learned what it meant to be abandoned. His courtiers often wondered about the dreams that visited him at night, not knowing that he rarely slept in conventional terms anymore. The boundary between waking and sleeping had been permanently blurred by his years in the tower, and he existed in a state of continuous semi-consciousness that allowed him to process information and solve problems with unprecedented clarity. The kingdom's chroniclers struggled to categorize his reign. It wasn't marked by great military campaigns or architectural marvels or cultural renaissance in the traditional sense. Instead, it was characterized by a kind of practical magic. Problems that had seemed intractable were quietly solved, conflicts that had raged for generations simply dissolved, and people discovered that they were capable of better behavior than they had previously imagined. Foreign scholars came to study his methods, hoping to understand the mechanisms by which he achieved such remarkable results with such minimal apparent effort. They interviewed his advisors, analyzed his policies, and observed court proceedings, but they consistently failed to identify any single technique or philosophy that could be replicated elsewhere. What they missed was that Cassius's effectiveness came not from any particular method, but from a fundamental shift in perspective that could only be achieved through experience they would never want to endure. He had learned in the deepest possible way that human beings were far more resilient and adaptable than anyone imagined, but also far more fragile and needful of compassion than most rulers acknowledged. His understanding of human nature had been earned through a kind of involuntary research project that had lasted 30 months and cost him his youth, his health, and his normal relationship with reality. But it had also given him insights that no amount of traditional education could provide, and these insights made him perhaps the most effective ruler in the kingdom's history. The tower still stood, though Cassius had ordered it sealed rather than destroyed. He understood that some places accumulate meanings that transcend their physical structure, and the Tower of Sorrows had become something like a sacred site, not because anything holy had happened there, but because something irreversible had been endured there. Occasionally, usually late at night when the castle was quiet, he would visit the sealed entrance to the tower, not to remember his suffering, but to acknowledge the person he had been before that suffering transformed him. The boy prince who had entered that stone chamber had died there, slowly and painfully, but his death had given birth to something that was perhaps more valuable than the comfortable life he might otherwise have lived. Standing before the sealed door, Cassius would sometimes think about his father, not with hatred or even sadness, but with a kind of profound appreciation for the unintended gift that Uldric's paranoia had provided. The king had meant to destroy his son, but had instead created something unprecedented, a ruler who understood both the necessity of power and the cost of wielding it. The greatest irony of the entire situation was that King Uldric had been right to fear his son, just not in the way he had imagined. The boy prince had indeed been a threat to everything Uldric represented: rule through fear, governance through intimidation, and the belief that strength came from the ability to inflict suffering rather than endure it. The man who emerged from the tower was infinitely more dangerous to tyranny than the boy who had entered it, but he was dangerous in ways that made tyranny unnecessary, rather than ways that simply replaced one form of oppression with another. Cassius had become living proof that human beings could be rebuilt rather than merely broken, and that rebuilding could create something stronger and more beautiful than the original construction. In the end, the story of the boy prince who rotted alive in his father's prison became a story about transformation rather than suffering, about the strange gifts that could emerge from the most impossible circumstances, and about the remarkable capacity of human consciousness to adapt, endure, and ultimately transcend even the most carefully designed systems of destruction. The kingdom prospered not because it had found a perfect ruler, but because it had found a ruler who understood that perfection was impossible and that the attempt to achieve it was the source of most political suffering. Cassius governed with the humility of someone who had been completely broken and the confidence of someone who had rebuilt himself from the fragments. And sometimes, when foreign diplomats or visiting scholars asked him about the source of his unusual wisdom, he would smile in a way that suggested depths they couldn't fathom and tell them simply that he had once lived in a very small room for a very long time, and that the experience had taught him everything he needed to know about human nature, political power, and the strange alchemy by which suffering could be transformed into understanding. The Tower of Sorrows had been designed to create a victim, but it had instead created something far more dangerous to the forces of cruelty and oppression. A ruler who knew from personal experience that human beings were capable of surviving anything, and that this survival was not just biological but spiritual, not just individual but collective, and not just possible but inevitable for anyone willing to endure the necessary transformation. In this way, the boy prince who had rotted alive in his father's prison became, paradoxically, the most alive ruler the kingdom had ever known, alive to possibility, alive to the hidden strengths of his people, alive to the profound responsibility that came with power, and alive to the beautiful, terrible, magnificent complexity of human existence in all its pain and promise. The story ended not with rescue or revenge, but with the quiet revolution of a man who had learned that the most powerful force in human affairs was not the ability to inflict suffering, but the capacity to transform it. And who had built a kingdom based on the radical proposition that people, given the chance, would choose to be better than their circumstances required. And the tower stood empty, its purpose fulfilled in ways its architect had never intended. A monument not to successful imprisonment, but to the indestructible nature of human consciousness and the strange, inexplicable alchemy by which the worst experiences could be transformed into the most profound wisdom. This was the true story of the boy prince who rotted alive imprisoned by his own father, not a tale of victimization, but of metamorphosis. Not a tragedy, but a strange kind of triumph. Not an ending, but a beginning disguised as destruction. The kingdom he ruled became proof that even the most carefully crafted cruelty could be transformed into unexpected mercy, and that the deepest darkness could give birth to the most surprising light. Years after his transformation into the most unusual ruler the kingdom had ever known, Cassius would sometimes receive visitors who came seeking the secret of his success. They expected to find ancient wisdom, complex philosophical systems, or perhaps revolutionary political theories that could be learned and applied elsewhere. Instead, they found a man who spoke in simple terms about simple truths that had been burned into his consciousness through experience no textbook could replicate. Power, he would tell them, sitting in a throne room that was deliberately modest and completely lacking in the intimidating grandeur that most rulers preferred, is not what you can do to others. It's what you can prevent others from feeling the need to do to you. This wasn't political theory. It was survival wisdom earned through 30 months of absolute powerlessness. When foreign dignitaries arrived expecting the usual diplomatic theatre of veiled threats and elaborate courtesy, they found instead a ruler who seemed genuinely interested in understanding their actual problems rather than scoring political points. He would listen with the focused attention of someone who had learned that human voices were precious commodities that should never be wasted, and he would respond with solutions that addressed root causes rather than surface symptoms. The kingdom's prosperity wasn't built on conquest or exploitation, but on the radical notion that helping others succeed was the most efficient path to one's own success. This approach baffled economic theorists and military strategists, but it worked with a consistency that eventually convinced even the most skeptical observers that perhaps traditional approaches to statecraft were not the only viable options. Cassius had learned in the tower that human beings were remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of finding meaning and even joy in the most impossible circumstances. This knowledge informed every policy decision he made, every law he enacted, and every diplomatic relationship he established. He governed as someone who understood that people's worst behaviors usually emerged from their deepest fears, and that addressing those fears was more effective than punishing the behaviors they produced. The justice system he created was based on restoration rather than retribution, not out of abstract moral principle, but because he had learned firsthand that punishment without understanding was merely institutionalized revenge that solved nothing while creating new problems. Courts focused on understanding why crimes had been committed and addressing those underlying causes, rather than simply inflicting suffering in response to suffering. His military was structured around defense and deterrence, rather than aggression, reflecting his understanding that true security came from making war unnecessary rather than making war inevitable. Soldiers were trained as engineers and diplomats as much as warriors, because he had learned that the most effective battles were the ones that were never fought. The economic policies he implemented were designed around the principle that stability was more valuable than spectacular growth, because he understood from personal experience that sudden changes, even positive ones, could be traumatic for people who had learned to survive within existing systems. Progress happened gradually, organically, in ways that allowed people to adapt rather than forcing them to react. But perhaps most remarkably, Cassius had developed what his advisors came to call the the gift of presence. When he entered a room, conversations didn't stop out of fear or formality, but because people found themselves genuinely interested in what he might say. He had learned in the tower to pay attention to details that others missed, to read the subtle signs of human emotion and motivation that most people ignored, and to respond to what people needed rather than what they claimed to want. This skill made him nearly impossible to deceive, but he used this ability with such gentleness that people rarely felt exposed or vulnerable in his presence. Instead, they felt understood in ways that were both comforting and slightly unsettling. It was as if he could see the frightened child hiding inside every adult, the idealist concealed within every cynic, the potential for goodness that most people had forgotten they possessed. The transformation of the kingdom under his rule happened so gradually that people barely noticed it was occurring. Crime rates declined not because punishments became harsher, but because the conditions that created crime were systematically addressed. International conflicts were resolved not through military intervention, but through patient diplomacy that focused on finding solutions that allowed all parties to claim some form of victory. Trade relationships flourished because Cassius approached commerce as an opportunity for mutual benefit, rather than a zero-sum competition where one party's gain required another's loss. His negotiators were instructed to look for ways to create value, rather than simply redistribute it, and they found that this approach led to agreements that were more stable and profitable for everyone involved. The cultural life of the kingdom bloomed in unexpected ways. Artists found that they could create work that was challenging and provocative without fear of censorship or persecution, because Cassius understood that creativity required freedom, even when that freedom produced uncomfortable truths. He had learned in the tower that the human imagination was capable of finding beauty and meaning in the darkest circumstances, and he wanted his kingdom to benefit from that creative resilience. Education became a priority not because an educated population was easier to control, but because Cassius believed that people who understood themselves and their world were less likely to be manipulated by demagogues or driven to desperate actions by fear and ignorance. Schools taught critical thinking alongside traditional subjects, encouraging students to question authority while also understanding the responsibilities that came with freedom. Religious tolerance was not just official policy but actual practice, because Cassius had learned in the tower that people found meaning and strength in many different ways, and that diversity of belief was a source of resilience rather than division. He had discovered that personal faith, whatever form it took, could provide the psychological resources necessary to endure impossible circumstances, and he wanted his people to have access to whatever spiritual tools they found most helpful. The architecture of the kingdom began to change as well, reflecting Cassius's understanding that physical environments shaped psychological states. Public buildings were designed to make people feel welcome rather than intimidated, with plenty of natural light, comfortable seating areas, and spaces that encouraged interaction rather than isolation. Even the royal palace was redesigned to be more accessible, with fewer barriers between rulers and ruled. Gardens became a particular obsession of his, not for their beauty alone, but for their demonstration that careful attention and patience could transform even the most unlikely spaces into sources of life and nourishment. He had learned to find meaning in the smallest signs of growth and change, and he wanted his people to have access to similar opportunities for quiet revelation. The legal code was simplified and clarified, eliminating the deliberately obscure language that had traditionally been used to prevent ordinary people from understanding their rights and obligations. Laws were written in plain language that anyone could comprehend, because Cassius believed that justice required transparency and that complexity was often just a mask for unfairness. Tax collection became less burdensome, not because rates were dramatically reduced, but because the system became more logical and predictable. People understood what they owed and why they owed it, and they could see the benefits that their contributions provided to the community. This transparency reduced resentment and increased voluntary compliance, making the entire system more efficient and less oppressive. Infrastructure projects focused on improvements that would benefit ordinary people in their daily lives, rather than monuments to royal vanity. Roads were built to facilitate trade and travel rather than to impress visitors with displays of wealth and power. Public works projects provided employment while creating lasting value for the community. The royal court became a place where merit mattered more than birth, where good ideas were welcomed regardless of their source, and where honest criticism was valued more than empty flattery. Cassius surrounded himself with advisors who had demonstrated wisdom through experience rather than theoretical knowledge, and he created an environment where disagreement was seen as an opportunity for learning rather than a threat to authority. Diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms were revolutionized by Cassius's approach to international affairs. Instead of the traditional mixture of threats, bribes, and elaborate ceremonies that characterized most royal interactions, he offered genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared benefit. His ambassadors were instructed to listen more than they spoke, to understand other cultures rather than impose their own, and to look for opportunities to solve common problems through cooperation. This approach initially confused and occasionally annoyed other rulers who were accustomed to the familiar dance of diplomatic theatre. But the practical benefits of dealing with a kingdom that kept its word, honored its agreements, and approached problems with creativity rather than aggression gradually won over even the most skeptical neighbors. Trade relationships became more stable and profitable for all parties involved, not because Cassius was unusually generous, but because he understood that sustainable partnerships required that everyone benefit from the arrangement. His merchants were known for their honesty and reliability, qualities that commanded premium prices in a world where commercial fraud was commonplace. Military alliances were based on genuine shared interests rather than temporary convenience or mutual fear. Other kingdoms found that Cassius was a valuable ally not because he was eager for conflict, but because he was so effective at preventing conflicts from escalating into wars. His ability to understand and address the root causes of international tension made him an invaluable mediator in disputes that might otherwise have led to costly military campaigns. The transformation of the kingdom was so complete and so gradual that by the time other rulers began to study Cassius's methods seriously, it was difficult to identify specific policies or reforms that could be credited with the success. The changes were systemic and cultural rather than merely administrative, reflecting a fundamental shift in how power was understood and exercised. Visiting scholars and diplomats often left the kingdom feeling somehow changed by their experience, though they struggled to articulate exactly what had affected them so profoundly. They had expected to find the usual mixture of political calculation and personal ambition that characterized most royal courts. But instead they had encountered something genuinely different, a ruler who seemed to operate from principles that had been tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The story of the boy prince who had rotted alive in his father's prison had become more than historical fact. It had become the foundation myth of a new kind of governance. The kingdom prospered not because it had found perfect solutions to political problems, but because it had found a ruler who understood that imperfection was the human condition, and that wisdom came from learning to work with human limitations, rather than pretending they didn't exist. In the end, the Tower of Sorrows had achieved something that no amount of conventional education could have provided. It had created a ruler who understood power because he had lived without it, who valued freedom because he had been denied it, who practiced mercy because he had received none, and who inspired loyalty because he knew what abandonment felt like. The kingdom became living proof that even the most carefully designed cruelty could be transformed into unexpected wisdom, that the deepest suffering could give birth to the most profound compassion, and that the human spirit was capable of not just surviving impossible circumstances, but of being transformed by them into something stronger, wiser, and more beautiful than anyone could have imagined possible.